1 century ago, the sky was filled with wondrous airships. This was the height of the era, the time when airships were being experimented with by the nations that had been adversaries in World War I and would become adversaries again in World War II. What were the limits of the capabilities of these airships? Was this just a temporary foray by the civilizations at the time to develop a new form of transportation? Or is there another story behind these airships? Was this some sort of technology that was rediscovered from a previous civilization? Or is it simply, as we're told in the mainstream account? Come join me today as we examine the account of airships and look for the actual explanation behind their rise and their fall.
I realize that nothing we've been doing is new. We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient.
Advanced airships, or the rigid airship design as it was known as. Originally they started off being called Zeppelins, and they were developed in Germany according to the official history. And yet, the other nations that contended for dominance with Germany developed their own airships, such as these designs from the United Kingdom that followed after World War I. The official history also tells us that Zeppelins were used to bomb the United Kingdom during World War I, prior to the advent of the long-range bombers that were used in World War II. And we see many interesting and intriguing designs that show the capability of these rigid airships. We don't have anything like rigid airships now today. Of course, there are other forms of airships. We think of balloons, and we of course think of the blimps that we often see in football games, such as the Goodyear blimp. But we can look and see this development timeline here of the airships from the United Kingdom, and we can see that most of their development actually started before the interwar period. And so it seems as though there was more of a, at least, sharing of technology or an awareness of this airship technology. The rigid airships were the most advanced, and they had the greatest capability of the blimps, and of course the other variations of balloons that had been around, at least since the 1700s according to the official history. And naturally we see how all these airships ended up in the United Kingdom, destroyed in trials, deleted and demolished, and as you look in the other designs, that's what you'll see. Yet, in this particular exploration, I'm going to try to showcase some images that are a little bit more rare, at least in terms of awareness. And we can see that these airships included massive hangars, other great capabilities that we often see in our explorations. There's also the many towers that have unique construction capabilities behind them that were used to moor these airships to. Perhaps the most interesting thing about airships, in addition to their all-terrain capability and their ability to move around regardless of certain situations, is where they can land or where they can moor to. This is a very interesting tower, and the building at the base of it is quite intriguing as well. What happened to all these towers? Were they all torn down? When we look at the rigid airship, though, we consider the mainstream historical account. We're informed that in the 1870s there was the initial idea to develop airships. Ah yes, another wondrous design plan that came from the 1800s, because what else would it be? Yet when you look at some of these images, you can see that there was a lot of detail that went into the construction of these airships. We have to think about the hangars, we have to consider all these materials that had to be assembled, processed, and yet at the same time, in the early 1900s to the 1930s, they managed to achieve all of this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this was impossible, just very impressive. And of course, the official history tells us why the airships had such a sudden rise to fame and popularity, and why they instantly diminished from their massive use. Would you be surprised to know that airships, or Zeppelins as they were called from Germany, provided the first transatlantic transportation? So imagine what kind of infrastructure capabilities you'd have. We'll be looking at the Graf Zeppelin later, perhaps the height of design of the rigid airship, and also the means in which it was funded. Apparently, William Randolph Hearst, who we've looked at before, was a significant proponent of airships and even provided financial support. Here we can even see one of the remaining airship hangars next to modern fighters. Something about it does seem to indicate, though, a greater advanced technology. And that's probably one of the main reasons why airships are so compelling, especially to alternative researchers. And yet, even if you accept the mainstream account of history, you have to acknowledge the fact that there was quite a lot of focus that was put into the development of the airship. Going off of the official history, with Germany developing the first airships, or Zeppelins as they called them, they seemed to understand the maximum capabilities that could be achieved with a rigid airship. There had never been any sort of flying device that could deliver munitions to another nation. And while this might be a more pernicious or violent form of use of airships, it does reflect their transportation capability. Indeed, with the construction of the Graf Zeppelin, we understand that Germany had achieved the heights of airship construction. And as part of the reparations for World War I, they even built an airship for the United States Navy, which apparently saved the Zeppelin program. This was the USS Los Angeles. So isn't this an intriguing account? We have Germany who attacked the United Kingdom, and you can find no shortage of monuments across the United Kingdom about airship attacks or Zeppelin attacks that occurred in World War I. Yet, apparently, Zeppelins were not regarded the same way that naval warships were, because after World War I, there was a lot of limitation concerning the construction of naval warships, as people feared their use. But apparently they didn't fear the Zeppelin. And so the United States and the United Kingdom decided to build or order their own Zeppelins from Germany, and then eventually improved upon their designs. At least, again, that's what the official history tells us. Of course, if you step far enough back, you have to realize that there's a lot more that goes into the construction of these impressive airships. You can see that there are no shortage of images of these vehicles being docked to towers and also being landed on the ground. And so it seems as though there's no limit to their capability. You don't have the same constraints that you do when you're operating fixed-wing aircraft or even rotary-wing aircraft. You actually have a capacity to transport logistics in a means that you can't even begin to conceptualize. Oddly enough, the interior photos of airships seem to be quite limited, and we tend to see a very austere making of the interiors, as though the crews were a little bit cramped, and we have to recall that the availability of images may or may not reflect the reality of what technological achievements that were brought about with the rigid airship. Now, we referred earlier to the blimps and the balloons and why they were limited. They didn't match the rigid airship in terms of their range and their capability to transport vast amounts of materials or logistics across vast distances. Here we can even see the construction of one of the original airships that was taken to the United States, which is how we explain there already being a U.S. logo on the side of it for the United States Navy. Very intriguing. We can also see in other images all the effort that went into the initial construction. So, step back and look at this holistically. You have to establish these massive hangars that are far larger than any of the hangars that we have for current fixed-wing aircraft. And you also have to be able to assemble all these advanced construction materials. They seem to be able to quickly share the designs and the plans and the schematics and rapidly assemble these airships. Also, from the mainstream historical account, there's no shortage of apparent disasters or failures that occurred. Some airships that were destroyed by bad weather, others that had simply been crashed for any variety of reasons, and this was well before the Hindenburg, which would be the final event that would end the era of the airship. So, in the mainstream historical account, we do have examples of the airships failing, but yet the nations did not deter from actually researching and building airships. Instead, they continued to build larger and more capable airships. But is that really what happened? Or, when we look at these images, are we actually seeing another example of technology that was recovered from a previous time? And the current nations of the current civilization were attempting to press these incredible devices back into service, trying to restore them, much in the same way that we theorize that older structures were actually restored and refurbished and brought back to service. Now consider if that may be true. Then it would explain why we have this rapid rise of airships across multiple regions. If Germany was so keen on its Zeppelin technology, then even after World War I, why would they be sharing it with the Allies, or at least the nations that were their former, and in the minds of many people at the time, according to the official historical account, their current adversaries? It tends not to make a lot of sense. And yet, oddly enough, it's a bit of a parallel with what happened with World War II, as the German war machine developed weapons that were very advanced, and then once the war ended, the Allied nations, or at least the nations that had been the Allies that would become NATO, and even the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations, all wanted to acquire this advanced weapons technology. It goes back to that whole story of the jet fighter. The United States Air Force was initially surprised by the jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, and yet the swept-wing design did not provide the Germans a decisive advantage. Official history tells us that they didn't have enough of them. But then the United States was surprised in the Korean War a few short years later when the MiG-15 surprised them as a swept-wing design. Ah yes, these great militaries always being so surprised. But going back to the original designs of the airship, we can see that there was a lot of effort that was put into it. You'll find these images that show these great airships operating over the wondrous cities of the land in the early 1900s. And according to the official history, the height of the airship was from the mid-1920s to the 1930s, ending with the Hindenburg disaster. A disaster that there just happened to be a camera crew there ready to film. And even though we have accounts of the other airships that failed in what seemed to be a spectacular fashion that were viewed by tens of thousands of people, this did not deter from the development. So what's really going on here? This is one of the questionable conflicting accounts that we have. Imagine what you could do, though, with the maximum capabilities of an airship. And looking at some of these advanced designs that we have, this seems to hint towards something that goes beyond what our understanding is of an airship. Now, granted, we're looking at images, and I acknowledge these images may or may not be authentic. That's always something we have to consider because there do seem to be certain questionable aspects about them. But ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide on the veracity of the images, as we always have to maintain a keen mind when we're doing these explorations. Do these really show these facilities that were actually discovered or rediscovered and pressed back into service that may have had these materials or these designs that were still stored within them for who knows how many of years? And we also have accounts of new materials that needed to be developed to complete the construction of these wondrous devices of transportation. So was it really what we were told with the historical development that Germany had these great ideas in the 1870s and finally Count von Zeppelin managed to bring them about to a successful design, and then the other nations simply bought or copied the designs and then attempted to improve on them? Or is there something a lot more behind all this? That this was understood to be an advanced element of transportation technology that was now available to the Fifth Era civilization. That, like the buildings you can see in these images, that they press this technology back into service. Because you'll find, oddly enough, the association of the airship with many science fiction concepts. The ability to be able to travel without limited range and consider what other means of propulsion they may have had. There's many conflicting accounts about how fast these airships were actually able to travel. Mainstream agrees that they were limited to 60 to 80 miles per hour, and of course it depends on the wind. But we also think back to the earlier accounts of the sailing ships during the so-called Age of Discovery, and how traveling at 9 miles per hour was considered quite an achievement for these sailing ships, and yet somehow they managed to sail tens of thousands of miles over just a few short months. That's from the mainstream historical account. Looking at some of the designs, though, of the rigid airship, and what makes it very impressive is the internal functioning and also the layout. Remember that the difference between the rigid airship and the blimp is that the rigid airship actually has the skeletal construction, which then has the outer skin put around it, and then, at least according to the official historical account, is filled with hydrogen. Although they preferred to use helium, as helium was certainly not flammable or inflammable or any of the other word tricks that you use with that which can easily catch on fire. You can see, though, that there are so many images that show that these rigid airships could land anywhere. There were towers that seemed to be all over the land that had to be constructed, in addition to the hangars. And here we see the Graf Zeppelin next to the R-101, both examples of the height of rigid airship technology from Germany and the United Kingdom. And quite an impressive sight to see these two airships in the same image. The construction photos, though, are intriguing as we oftentimes just see the skeletal examples of the hull of the rigid airships. But oftentimes we see few workers that are actually involved. There's also the matter of where were the designs for these incredible towers that seem to be all over the place. These towers that seem to be constructed just for the sole purpose of mooring an airship. Now you might ask, well, if they could just land anywhere on the ground, what would you need the towers for? Perhaps there was some other explanation for what the towers were actually used for. Or maybe we have to consider that there were so many airships that having the towers enabled you to moor several of them to the tower. Granted, it's a theory, but when you look at some of the internal schematics for what we have of airships, there seems to be a lack of understanding for what their true layout or purpose was. Indeed, we have little notes that are added and other notes that are added to try to indicate exactly what the real purpose and layout of the gondola or the control center was. I think what's most intriguing to me about airships, and I will confess that I've always had a personal interest in aviation, and whether it's fixed-wing aircraft, rotary aircraft, and of course airships, there's always the amazing capability of what flying could really provide to a civilization. You could say it ultimately frees the individual to be able to travel anywhere in the land. It also gives the capability of a civilization to rapidly transport large quantities of material, improving the infrastructure. You don't need to rely on roads. Now, of course, we do have to acknowledge what are some of the vulnerabilities with the airship. Officially, we understand that they are vulnerable to bad weather. Also, they could not travel as fast as the fixed-wing aircraft that were just in their infancy. Although I think what's most interesting to me when I did the research concerning rigid airships is the fact that they were the ones that provided the first transatlantic transportation capability. Long before Lindbergh even did his first transatlantic flight, and the great masters of aviation from the late 1920s through the 1930s achieved their feats. When you look at some other images of the components of airships, you can't help but be impressed by how advanced they appear. Here we see examples of the interior design having construction materials that seem to match some of the most capable and advanced materials that went into planes. And keep in mind what we know about fixed-wing aircraft from World War I. They were very rudimentary. They're really just a few levels beyond the gliders that the Wright brothers used with just a single propeller. And those were the mainstays of World War I. And yet during World War I and right after World War I in the interwar period, all the nations were using these rigid airships, at least all the nations that would become the primary antagonists of World War II. So was there really some sort of research effort that was being undertaken? Someone was looking for some sort of decisive advantage that they would have. And of course, we don't know the exact situation that was going on at that time. We're certainly informed of it, but it's very odd that Germany, the nation that was blamed for World War I and had to pay war reparations, was still encouraged to continue this Zeppelin development. In fact, we're even informed that Zeppelins would have died out in the 1920s if it wasn't for the sudden order by the United States for the USS Los Angeles, as the USS Los Angeles was a rigid airship that had many of the same design principles as the Graf Zeppelin. And let's explore the Graf Zeppelin, the very best design. The Graf Zeppelin is most famous for the fact that it seemed to be the most traveled of the great rigid airship designs. And you'll find no shortage of images of the Graf Zeppelin over every major and recognizable terrain across the land, such as in the United States. And the other strange thing is, according to the official account, the Graf Zeppelin, being a German Zeppelin or rigid airship, was welcomed and even funded by someone such as William Randolph Hearst. You know, when he wasn't busy building his amazing castle out there in the isolated portion of the Western California coast. You can see, though, that wherever the Graf Zeppelin was, there were images taken of its immense presence and its wondrous inspiration over the great terrain features or incredible structures that reflect an entirely different existence. And people often wonder why alternative researchers can get the idea that these rigid airships reflected a very different time. When you see these images with these old world buildings, it almost gives us the impression that this was a completely different world, that this was a time that never really existed in the manner that we were told. Now, perhaps that's just simply a coincidence of appearances, and it's also just another coincidence that the images of these great airships over these old world cities happen to inspire other science fiction tales. Or perhaps there's an entirely different account that we might not be aware of. Concerning the Graf Zeppelin, we understand its wondrous capabilities and its ability to transit the entire world. We're informed that, according to the mainstream account, the Graf Zeppelin was the first aircraft that did a round-the-world trip. Now, again, this was due to funding and the sale of special stamps, apparently. It was also because of the support of William Randolph Hearst and other individuals. Why exactly would these individuals from the United States be so keen on supporting this transportation capability, this unique design that came from a rival nation? And even during the period of the Weimar Republic, that was the government that Germany had after the end of World War I, before the rise of the National Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s, why would these nations be willing to fund this device? And you can see there are some images that show us some of the opulence and amazing luxury that was available on the Graf Zeppelin, and subsequently the Hindenburg. Now, the Graf Zeppelin was the largest rigid airship of its time, and the Hindenburg exceeded it. But the Graf Zeppelin is most famous because it had the greatest achievements, flying around the world or across the lands, however you want to look at it, and even committing a polar flight. All very impressive. Why is it that the nations turned away from these airship designs if they knew that the answer was helium? Because the Hindenburg disaster simply revolved around the use of hydrogen, which, unfortunately, was prone to failure, or at least quite a difficult situation with fire. Looking at the round-the-world flight, we have conflicting accounts between how long this flight took. Officially, it was 22 days, but there are other accounts that say that the flight occurred in a much shorter amount of time. Now, I wasn't there, I don't know for sure, but even at the 22 days figure, the fact that this was the first aircraft, any form of aircraft, that managed to complete a round-the-world or across-the-lands flight is very impressive. And that's probably the most interesting element of the Graf Zeppelin, is the fact that it went everywhere and anywhere. And again, here in the Soviet Union, where the Graf Zeppelin operated out of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, and Archangel all the way up on its little polar expedition. Apparently, all the former adversarial nations to Germany decided to support the development and use of this incredible Zeppelin. And is it just because everybody was utterly enamored with the technology? The polar journey of the Graf Zeppelin is intriguing in and of itself, as it involved meeting up with an individual on site to showcase the capabilities of the Graf Zeppelin. And perhaps that's one of the most alluring details that we have about these rigid airships, is that they could go anywhere. We have an account of the Graf Zeppelin going anywhere, such as linking up with this Norwegian explorer who bears a striking resemblance to Mark Hamill from the film Slipstream. There were even other airships that were actually employed to support this journey, and earlier airship journeys that actually enabled the explorers to finally reach the North Pole. So isn't it interesting how even in the mainstream account, the use of airships and their capabilities finally allowed people to reach areas that they had never reached before? And it was as though the Graf Zeppelin was merely a culmination of this developing technology. But was it? Or was this a technology that was already well known and was simply being tested to see what the limits of its capabilities were? Was the Graf Zeppelin really flying around the world just to show that it could be done? Was it really flying up to the Arctic just to show that it could be done? Or was there some other intention behind this? Was this really truly the unlimited range mission that only a rigid airship could undertake, to really explore the very limits of the land? Oddly enough, we're supposed to believe that Captain Cook was the one who defined the limits of the land, even though he missed discovering the entire Antarctic continent. Well, if you have a rigid airship, you can go anywhere. You can explore anything. You have no limitations on your range. And ultimately, if you can build a larger one, if you can lay it out with all of the needs and requirements of the crew and the passengers, you really have an airship that could go anywhere. And the Graf Zeppelin proved that it could be done. And amazingly enough, it managed to complete all these achievements without any sort of disaster. Now, they certainly ran into difficulties. After all of these incredible achievements, though, the Graf Zeppelin finally met its untimely demise when, after the destruction of the Hindenburg, it was simply forgotten and scrapped, to be used by a regime that would go on to conduct World War II. And thus the great achievements of the Graf Zeppelin seem to have been lost to history in many ways. Yet there was a time when this was, according to the mainstream account even, the pioneering advent of the capability of what we could do in the air. And it's probably one of the reasons why this continues to be an alluring account for us of what the rigid airship could do. You couldn't do this with a blimp, you couldn't do this with a balloon. But yet, what was the true time that the Graf Zeppelin managed to travel, whether it was across the lands or up on its polar expedition? People will claim that they know the exact times, and maybe they are correct. But there are other accounts that say otherwise. And let's look at the future or past, but not the present. So the account that airships could provide wondrous transportation capabilities in the future. We have seen articles that allude to the revival of the airship or a great renaissance in the use of the rigid airship and other means of powering them. We also have the visualization of how airships, according to the official history, have inspired science fiction or even the steampunk genres. Great fleets of airships that went across the sky, and perhaps they utilized other means of managing to defy whatever the pull is from the ground, whether you consider it gravity or something else. We even have this wondrous image of something such as the Eiffel Tower that might have been a great mooring post for airships. And suddenly the construction of the Eiffel Tower makes a lot more sense as something that had an applicable use to support transportation, and not merely as a wondrous showcasing trinket for yet another World's Fair. How far could they have gone with these advanced designs of these airships? Would they even be considered airships at all? Perhaps that's the only way to refer to them as. Did they have some other means of propulsion and some other means of sustaining their altitude in the air? Was it always helium and hydrogen that were used, or were there other means that could have been used to keep these very impressive and colossal devices in the air? Or is this just simply the realm of science fiction, simply imagination that's gone too far? It is intriguing to think of the fact, though, that there were actual achievements of airships, and you can find no shortage of photos that show people walking into the actual hull of a rigid airship from one of the mooring towers. And so this does give us the impression that there were many capabilities that perhaps were simply not shared with us. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was some sort of intentional effort not to share the true capabilities of airships, but if we had nations that knew or had an idea that they were going to be involved in another worldwide or global conflict, as it were, soon, then perhaps they simply had a good reason to keep all of their classified documents secret. I mean, it makes total sense. You just buy your airship and you employ it and you refine it. Such as this very impressive design that shows the use of airship in terms of even carrying aircraft. And there were even airships that were aircraft carriers that the United States attempted to use. And of course, both of them wrecked in bad weather or very questionable conditions. Consider what a civilization could do if it had airships that had no limits in terms of their range and their carrying capacity. What kind of materials could you transport where and when? Does this suddenly explain one of the means in which the previous civilization could have achieved its wondrous constructions of great buildings and structures across the land? Is it also another more elaborate form of infrastructure and transportation when you have advanced capacities on the ground taken in tandem with these incredible airships and what they could have achieved? This is probably the most alluring exploration when it comes to considering what the limits on this exploration were. And finally, what could we do if we had our own airship, if everybody had their own rigid version of the airship that they could explore anywhere in the land without a limit on range or capacity? Suddenly, it completely turns around everything from our understanding of the limits of technology. There's also the question that we have to ask is, why would the great nations of the land after World War II suddenly want to abandon the practicality of the rigid airship, the ability to continue to develop something that would defy the limitations of transportation at that time? Now, of course, we'll get the usual slew of explanations that it just simply wasn't in their best interest to do so, and that may be true. They simply opted to pursue the fixed-wing aircraft and the very large cargo aircraft capacities that we have. And yet you'll find no shortage of images. You'll find no shortage of ideas that go all the way back from the time of Jules Verne, which give us the idea that airships perhaps provided an entirely different form of existence, a more liberated form of the ability to travel, and not just to travel, but also to transport materials from one point to another. It doesn't matter what kind of terrain that you actually have, whether it's mountains or flatlands or even the coastal areas. You can transport anywhere at any point in time. And it may simply be speculation in terms of how far the capability of these airships actually evolved to. Yet, once again, there's no shortage that we have, much like with the buildings, that show that there are many different sketches, many different plans and ideas for how airships could have been used, such as this much larger airship that features an entire hospital on the top of it. You suddenly have the ability to have that truly mobile hospital, and you have all the capacity and capability that you need. Now, expand this to other ideas, other forms of civilization or a society that's no longer limited by time or space or range. Then you suddenly see the true potential of the rigid airship, the once more advanced design. But what are your thoughts? Was this a device from a previous civilization? Or is the mainstream account correct? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.